wanted to believe that Christopher Morcom's mind somehow still survived. He wrote to Mrs. Morcom frequently saying he felt Christopher was helping him. But you see, he didn't just want to think of this as a comforting thought, a happy, convenient belief. He had to have a scientific reason for believing this was actually true. Christopher's death inspired him to look very seriously at what modern science was saying about the nature of the mind, how the mind can be embodied in the physical world.
By the time the memorial window to Christopher Morcom had been dedicated, Turing had been up at Cambridge for 2 years. At King's College, science and mathematics were taken seriously, and so was Turing. He was awarded a fellowship at the age of 22. Someone made up a rhyme about it. Turing must have been alluring to get made a Don so early on.
The unique thing about King's College that Turing must have found as soon as he arrived here is that it gave a particular kind of atmosphere of moral support for anyone who was homosexual, as Turing was discovering that he was. And there were well-known figures there who one reads about, people like Maynard Keynes and so forth, who were well documented in their relationships. But it wasn't just that, it's a real sense of moral seriousness, that one should be what one is, and that that's the right thing to be and the right thing to feel. But for Turing especially, he has a very fresh view of everything. He didn't see things in the conventional way. He always had to try to get a different look at everything, and that was the secret to his intellectual work. And this sense of differentness and unorthodoxy is all part and parcel of his sexuality and of his intellectual life as well.
Turing's ideas about computing machines emerged in 1935 when he solved a profound and abstruse problem in the foundations of mathematical logic, Hilbert's Entscheidungsproblem. At the turn of the century, the German mathematician David Hilbert had asked, was mathematics decidable? Did there exist a definite method which could, in principle, be applied to any assertion, and which was guaranteed to produce a correct decision as to whether that assertion was true? Turing later said that it was while out running in Grantchester Meadow that he had first seen how to answer Hilbert's question.
The difficulty of the question, as a mathematical question, is not just about mathematics. You see, it's about what you mean by a method, a rule, a very vague word, a word you might use in everyday life, but not with a clearly defined meaning. Well, Alan Turing gave it a meaning, an absolutely precise meaning, because he thought, well, what would such a rule or procedure be? It would be something you could do mechanically, something you could do, let a machine work on. And now, in 1935, there were no such machines. This is just an imaginary machine. It's a machine of thought. But he made it into an absolutely definite idea, and it's the idea of the Turing machine. And I can quite see that it would be at one spot, at one moment, they could have seen how you could use this precise idea, and the whole thing would click.
Turing's paper described how any logical process could be broken down into its simplest possible components, precise sequential steps that could, in principle, be carried out by a machine. With this new definition of method as machine, he was able to formulate a logical paradox which rapidly disposed of Hilbert's question.
Only somebody totally original and uninfluenced by fashion could have written that paper. Its purpose, which was not the same as its ultimate influence, was to show that a certain task was impossible. And that, again, is very, very difficult to do, and indeed difficult to understand. Most people would think that if you the fact that people had tried to do something a lot and failed would more or less show that it was impossible. But that's not the case, because one day somebody might find how to do it. And what Alan Matt was trying to demonstrate, and succeeded in demonstrating, was that a certain task could never be performed.
Well, Turing's ideas didn't just stop at the technical field of mathematical logic. His vision was much larger than that. And the thing that really drove him on was thinking, what is a mental process? What is any process by which, by thinking, we could arrive at any conclusion at all? What are our brains doing when we're thinking? And that was the argument in the background of this paper that he then wrote in 1935 and 1936. And his argument was that any mental process whatever, assuming that the brain works in some definite way, which it must do, it must have a mechanical basis to it, then it must be something which could be simulated by a Turing machine. So he had a way of formulating what any possible mental process must be. That was his general argument. And that's the argument which looms larger and larger in his thought and is now the basis of his ideas about artificial intelligence.
In the course of solving Hilbert's problem, Turing had an insight of the greatest importance. His original conception had required a different Turing machine for each logical task, but he went on to imagine a universal machine which could read and execute the instruction set of any single Turing machine and therefore perform all possible logical tasks. He had, in effect, formulated the idea of the stored program computer.
And it didn't matter too much what the actual hardware details of the machine was, as long as you were sure that the individual steps were dead simple. So he needed some way of imagining this, so he concocted the idea of a paper tape, which had either a 0 or a 1 in each cell, and a very simple imaginary machine which just chugged back and forth, left and right, on this single paper tape, which was imagined to be infinitely extended in both directions. And what he proved was that such a simple machine, with a finite number of separate states in it, each state saying what would happen if you saw a 0 or a 1, whether you'd move left or right, and whether you would erase the symbol and replace it with the other one, or leave the symbol as it is, that's all you needed in order to compute any computable function. So it was a sort of existence proof that there could be a mechanical device which, by simply compounding and iterating all of these simple steps, could do any computation that any human being sitting at a desk and using his wits could do.
Well, it's very surprising that Turing could do this. He was a complete outsider to the field of mathematical logic. All the experts in that field in America or Germany, they'd never heard of him. He was only 23. He was a no one in the mathematical world. And yet he came up with this idea which really changed the field, was completely accepted, is now the foundation of modern computer science. But why could he do this? I mean, apart from being clever, I think the thing is he had his underlying fascination with the whole question of how to describe the mind, what the mind is, how it can be embodied in matter. And it goes back to all his wanderings at the time of Christopher Morcom's death. The answers that he tried to find then, well, he abandoned those lines of thought and came onto this new line, which used this new idea of computer logic, as we now think of it.
The full beauty, depth, and power of Turing's revolutionary ideas would not be appreciated for years. Turing himself was about to be caught up in something far removed from the purity of mathematical logic.
A convoy at sea, one of the lifelines upon which the United Nations war effort relies. Obviously, the world's battlefronts must be kept constantly supplied with food and materials of all kinds. Admiral Dönitz and the German Navy are determined to see that these supplies don't get through, and the U-boat is certainly Hitler's most effective weapon. The U-boat, in fact, forms one of their most powerful threats to Allied victory.
The Nazi High Command was determined to avoid a repetition of the debacle of the First World War, when British intelligence routinely decoded German military signal traffic. The key was an enciphering machine called Enigma. Enigma machines were produced by the thousand and used by the entire German military system. Every U-boat carried one to receive operational orders. To stop the U-boats, Enigma had to be broken. Enigma was the most advanced enciphering device of its time. It encoded messages via an electromechanical system incorporating moving wheels or rotors. A character typed on the keyboard was sent through the rotors electrically, and the code equivalent read off an illuminated panel. The rotors changed their relative positions during encipherment to scramble the patterns a codebreaker looks for. The cipher circuits also went through a plug board which switched letter pairs. Rotor and plug board configurations were changed at regular intervals, sometimes daily. The codebreaker's task was to identify the start positions of the rotors and unravel the plug board setup. The difficulties were formidable.
One can say how many different possible states there were for the machine, which was of the order of 10 raised to the power 19, in other words, 1 followed by about 19 zeros, if my memory is correct. And I think the U-boat Enigma, which had an extra wheel, was more like 10 to the 22, approximately. Well, that gives you some idea, but it doesn't really give you a full idea, because clearly you couldn't possibly work through all those possibilities. That would be known as the British Museum attack on the system, exhaustive attack. You have to break down the attack in some way, and of course that's what we were doing.
Halfway between Oxford and Cambridge, Bletchley Park was the headquarters of the wartime British code-breaking effort. The postal address was Room 47, Foreign Office. 50 years later, the cryptanalytic machines no longer exist, and some of the methods used are still secret. Mathematicians, chess players, linguists, statisticians and engineers were recruited from all over Britain. At its height, the Bletchley operation involved 10,000 people. Alan Turing was one of the first to arrive.
He'd always been interested in codes and ciphers from school anyway. And so it's an amazing thing that after thinking about these abstract processes and methods that he was doing in thinking about the idea of the Turing machine, he found himself now actually responsible for real methods in a very real world, and in fact the most sophisticated methods and processes that had ever been thought of, and the most complicated mechanical ideas that probably ever been used in the fight against the German Enigma machine.
Turing's most important contribution, I think, was part of the design of the bomb, the cryptanalytic machine. He had the idea that you could use, in effect, a theorem in logic which sounds to the untrained ear rather absurd, namely that from a contradiction you can deduce everything.
It was like a joke in mathematical logic, which had this payoff in the cryptanalysis procedure and in the types of machines which they went on to build in 1940. It was always touch and go, very, very difficult. Every month, every year was a new battle with new details, new complications, new sophistications that were introduced. Turing was in the thick of that all the time and applying not just logic but really sophisticated ideas in statistics, completely new methods, new ideas for how to solve the problems which arose.
I'm not an intelligence person. I mean, not a historian. But one thing was clear. There was a period when we couldn't decipher